So I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning. It's James Donaldson, the CEO of British Columbia's Food and Beverage Association. James is the commander of the BC Food and Beverage Mothership. As the head of their lean mean, although I'm assured they're not really mean, James brings nearly 30 years of industry knowledge and experience to the membership. The genuine care James has for each of the members, his team, in the industry is one of the many reasons he is so well respected and admired. His humility, fairness, and down-to-earth nature makes him an exceptional leader. And he's also pretty darn funny. So, James?
Thank you. My mom wrote that, actually, so that was really nice. No, that was my staff. I'm the oldest one on my team, and they love to. I didn't know that every joke that I tell is a dad joke, but I guess when you have a team that's younger, every joke is a dad joke. So it's too bad. I didn't know what a dad joke was until now. Everything they laugh at is a dad joke. So, but they're a fun group. So I'm really happy to be here today. I guess this is day 3, 8:30 in the morning on day 3. So if I keep you all awake, it's a win, and if I don't, then you can blame me if you have a crappy golf game this afternoon. So, I appreciate very much the introduction. It's funny. I was just thinking. I think when Trish reached out to me about speaking, with COVID, and I think it was August of 2019. So I don't usually get booked that early. So I actually don't do a lot of these. I do a lot of specific food industry events. And ironic, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I start squeaking like a mouse about halfway through. We actually had our big industry conference. It was supposed to be in January, and then we moved it. And of course, the only available date at the hotel was June 9th. So we had 500 people at the Park Vancouver yesterday, and I had to MC it. So it was a pretty long couple of days with the team. But anyway, so I came up last night, and I noticed I was starting to get a little raspy. So I'm thanks to the guys at the table here for letting me chat a bit to warm up my voice, because this morning I sounded like a frog. So as you mentioned, I've been CEO of the association since 2014, so we're just coming up on 8 years. But I've been in the industry for 30 years. I've worked for big companies and small, and I also consulted for several years, so got to work with a lot of different companies. So I've seen a lot of trends over the years. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the food industry, talk about supply chain, some of the impacts the last 2 years have had. Obviously, they've been pretty significant, and if you're from BC, we'll chat a little bit about some of the impacts on the flood crisis and what's happened, and then talk a bit about labor and some of the challenges and where automation is and technology is really going to have to play a critical role over the long term. So BC Food and Beverage, we're a nonprofit association, so we have small, medium, and large companies. If you know the food industry in BC, it's huge, but it's mostly small businesses. Like even the big companies in BC are quite small by, say, Ontario and Quebec standards, and certainly very small by international standards. Maple Leaf and Nature's Path and Purdy's and some of those sorts of companies. A lot of those brands people are familiar with, but they're well under $1 billion in revenue. So even the big companies are small, as we say here. We have about 500 members. We have 2 types. We have processor members, and then we also have associate members. So anybody that's the service providers, packaging companies, law firms, things like that. So we always, kind of what we try to do is connect them, people who need help with those that can provide it. So we try to build out our network and create a lot more connectivity. So our combined members, though, we do represent about $7 billion in revenue, about 22,000 jobs based on our estimations. We used to be the BC Food Processors Association for the first 15 years of our life, and then we decided to change it to be a little bit more, just felt like it was a little bit more in keeping with what the industry actually is here. So we basically have sort of 4 kind of core things that we focus on. So it's, to really connect people with each other. It's quite an interesting community. There's, over 3,000 processors in BC. They're all spread out all over the place. They all think they have to reinvent the wheel. They think they're the only people that have ever gone through some of those challenges that they're dealing with as entrepreneurs. And we try and bring them together because there's a lot to gain from shared learning. And just education and create innovative ways of connecting with people. There's so much information they need. Big companies don't need help with a lot, right? They'll have their own R&D teams, they'll have their own staff to do all sorts of things, whereas small companies is 1 or 2 people wearing 4 or 5 hats each. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know. So we try to help sort of fill some of those gaps to the best we can. Just find innovative different ways of connecting people. COVID was certainly an example of that. We have a lot of large events, like the event we had yesterday. we used to do it annually, and we haven't had it. It was our first live event in 3 years. So, just kind of bringing people together. So finding online ways of connecting with people, it's tough, right? Everybody had to wear pants coming here. It's probably had so many Zoom calls over the last few years. It's good. Everyone wore them though, so that's good. I didn't hear anything about that. And then the other key part is we have to be a voice for industry. When you got a very diverse group of companies and products and ownership, entrepreneurs, family businesses. It's so diverse. So we try to be their collective voice to the best we can. We're a regional association, so a lot of the advocacy work happens regionally. But then I'm also on the board of Food and Beverage Canada, which is a national advocacy group. So I spend a fair amount of time in Victoria and Ottawa, making sure that government sort of understands what the issues are and sort of solutions and recommendations on policies to address them. Yeah, so the industry's, it's $11.1 billion, and that usually catches a lot of people off guard because forestry, I think, is 11.5 or 11.6. So it's a very large sector. Employs 36,000 people, and it's been growing every year. Even during COVID, we had a lot of small businesses get hurt. Imagine if you were selling to the cruise ship sector or the hospitality sector or to airlines. A lot of those small businesses. When you start off, you have to sell into one channel. You can't diversify as a startup and sell into retail and food service and institutional. You can't do that. You spread yourself too thin. So a lot of the smaller businesses will focus on some of those channels. Well, it was too hard to shift for a plan B. So we lost a lot of smaller businesses, but the bigger businesses have been showing a lot of resiliency. So the industry actually even sort of grew top line revenue wise during COVID. So we were actually a little surprised that happened. We know that they're a tough group and it's not an easy industry, but they're even tougher than we gave them credit for. So, and they export almost $5 billion as well. So yeah, as I mentioned before, it's a very large number of small processors here. It's very entrepreneurial. It's great. It's very dynamic, but it's also sometimes really hard to get their attention just because they're so focused on, the entrepreneurs generally look at the world this way. They don't have the luxury to be able to have that broader perspective just because they're always dealing with fires and putting out day-to-day things. And I've said there's very few big businesses here. Value added is really key. Like if you compare to some of the other provinces, so much of our industry here is really focused on value added. So it's taking agricultural products and really branded plant-based items. It's a very diverse sector, but the focus is really on value added, which is always bringing in unique needs for technology, a lot of innovation. So a lot of sort of niche, unique, and innovative products that generally come from BC. There's been obviously a huge slant towards health. A lot of the smaller businesses, we had a trade show a couple weeks ago. We went to a trade show a couple weeks ago, and I think 62% of the exhibitors were plant-based businesses. So, that's plant-based is a trend that's been growing, but, almost 2/3 of the exhibitors there were all focused on plant-based items. It was really, really something to behold. We were even surprised at how it's sliding that way. And obviously that's one of the many range of products, but, we have seafood, we have dairy, the craft industry, just the craft brewing industry is exploding here, just like it is in most other provinces, which gives us great selection. The wine industry here is obviously very significant. And even some of the new trends, like we had 3 or 4 members that are actually focused on seaweed, so they're growing seaweed and finding application for that. So yeah, there's always something new, and that's probably my favorite part of the job is that I don't think I've ever had, the same day twice. It's always kind of dealing with different people with different issues. We can't be experts on all of those, though. It's way too diverse. I could have a team of 50, and we could never be able to deal with all of the sort of subsectors that are in the industry. So the way we kind of look at it is, most of the companies, everyone focuses on what makes them unique, which is so important because differentiation is always a very, very important part of any business. But, we try to focus on the 80% that makes them the same. Like they all have issues around labor, they all have issues around supply chain and getting access to customers and regulatory issues and food safety programs. And those are all common things. As long as you're making food, those are all things you have to deal with. So we really try to kind of provide education and leadership and helping them understand and navigate those key areas that are unique to the food industry. So yeah, just for some national perspective, so it's a $120 billion industry across the country. And I think what makes the food industry very unique is just the barriers to entry are so low. We see new entrants come in all the time because if you have a recipe and you have a place to make your product You can sell to farmers markets. You know, you can get money from family and friends. It doesn't take a lot of money to get started. It takes a lot more money to kind of scale up. And that's what we see. We see all these startups kind of get started and try and find their way. And the problem is when you're selling just to farmers markets, it's you might be able to pay for make a little bit of money, but you have to reinvest in the business. But you're not going to actually be able to pay yourself. So ultimately, entrepreneurs, if they want to have a sustained business model, they actually have to be able to pay themselves and earn a living and everything, and not just put a second mortgage on their house. So you can get started, but the challenges of scaling up, getting into retail, very, very challenging. But as opposed to like the auto industry, you would probably need to borrow $5 billion from your parents if you wanted to start your own line of cars. So it's a little bit different. But it is a pretty low margin industry. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it's interesting because the food industry is a very large number of small companies. And if you look at the retail environment in Canada, it's a very small number of large companies. And when I say large, I mean really, really large. You look at the top 50 companies in Canada, and the top 5 retailers in Canada represent 85% of all grocery revenue. So imagine having thousands and thousands of businesses across the country, and there's like 85% of that business would be with 5 customers. And if one of them doesn't like you, like, where do you go? You can't replace Loblaws with 20 other customers. And because of consolidation in Canada, like the retailers, there's some very small retailers, and there's very, very large, very, very big ones, but there's not a lot in between anymore. Like Save-On-Foods is one of the only real regional retailers of any real size. So some of them have 20 stores or 30 stores, but even the ones in BC, they're all subsidiaries, have already been purchased by the larger retailers. So they've just kept the same name on the store, but they're all owned by Loblaws. I mean, Loblaws bought even T&T Supermarket. It's a small ethnic supermarket chain, and they bought them, and the Neighborhood Grocers and Real Canadian Superstore. So there's all these different banners under Loblaws, but it's still Loblaws, and they all kind of deal with you in a common way. So, and they haven't been very popular in your industry lately either. Yeah, and then it's funny, then when you talk to government, you look at how government's structured. You'd think that agriculture is this big and processing is this big. It's amazing. It feels like it's a complementary offshoot to agriculture, but processing is actually twice as big as agriculture. Yeah, it's funny. So if you look at the BC Ministry of Agriculture, they'll have 300 staff, and they have a team of 4 focused on food processing, and everybody else is focused on agriculture. So it's really interesting that it's $11.1 billion industry, and they have 4 people focused on it, and they have 300 people, or almost 300 people focused on a $6 billion industry. So just an interesting way. The way I always joke about it from sort of a policy and advocacy perspective, I think agriculture had a 150-year head start on processing, and it's because we're so spread out all over the place, and it's a very regionalized industry too. The food economies are very regionalized, so sometimes it's hard to kind of bring that consolidated common voice. So when dealing with government, so anyway, agriculture's been really good at it, and they've started out of the gate. So yeah, one of the other notes, and I'll come back to this later, but there was a report that came out about 5 years ago from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, and they actually, of all the manufacturing sectors, the food industry has by far the oldest equipment, and it's a bit of a missed opportunity. I think about several years ago, I don't know if any of it. Some of you are maybe as old as me and remember it, but when the Canadian dollar was actually at par. And it was probably a unique and small window where the industry could actually invest in technology in a really meaningful way, except they were so happy that they were actually finally making decent margins. They focused on that, and then within a year, it was 30% difference again. So, and the problem when you're investing in technology, so often it ends up coming from the US or from Europe. It becomes very problematic. So I'd say the industry is underinvested in technology, but I also think that's the biggest opportunity for our industry to scale capacity, not just regionally, but nationally. And I think we have to, because we'll talk about labor in a second, but that's really going to be the only long-term solution for that. So not without its challenge, and these are not just unique to the food industry for sure. I'm sure Andrew will probably touch on some of these as well. Skilled and unskilled labor is a huge problem. We've got 2 really big problems with labor, though. We just don't have enough people in this country, so there's not enough available labor, but the number of people that want to do some of these jobs is also shrinking. I have 3 kids, and I've talked to them about some of these jobs, so imagine how much money would motivate you to spend 8 hours a day in a chilled room at 3 degrees peeling shrimp. Like, you can pay somebody $20 to do that. That might sound like a lot of money to them, or $22 an hour. They'll last 3 days. Like what we're hearing regularly from from our members are, in a year they'll hire 32 people and they'll lose 32 people. It's like they're constantly hiring, because even when they start to fill those vacant roles, it's just, it's like, I kind of describe it like running up a down escalator right now when you're hiring people. And these are companies that have really good cultures. They pay their people well. This isn't about, this sweatshop type of dynamic. I think sometimes people get that misnomer where, employment, people leave businesses for that reason. And there's a million reasons why employees leave. But, some of this work, it's some of that granular work that has to happen in the food industry to put food on the table. It's not sexy. Like I said, the peeling shrimp in the cold room, or chopping chicken, or cleaning guts off floors. Like those are just things that need to absolutely happen, but nobody wants to do them anymore. So that's where I've said for years, people are never going to fill that gap. And we'll talk more about that. But the foreign workers programs, there's government's done a lot of things around foreign labor. That doesn't really apply. It applies to a lot of areas of Ontario and Quebec where they've got some large manufacturing facilities in more rural areas, because you have to provide housing for foreign workers. So if you have a facility in Richmond, in BC, I mean, you'll have to house 200 foreign workers. That would probably cost you $40 million a year. You'd probably have to buy a whole condominium complex. So, and which would not be easy. So, but there's no way you can make money. There's no way you can make money doing that. So it's not really. And we're so food processing in BC is so urbanized. It's Victoria. A lot of it's in Vancouver, Okanagan. So all those areas, just even the cost of land and everything is so high. It's just very cost prohibitive. So it works for agriculture, works for rural manufacturing, but most rural manufacturing are abattoirs. Does everybody know what an abattoir is? It's a really fancy word kind of for slaughterhouse. So I love how they rebranded it. Yeah, we talked a little bit about the difficult retail landscape. That's a problem. And then just the availability of space in BC, it's insane. I get calls from commercial realtors hoping that I know someone that's, in the last year of their lease and they're trying to move out of it to move into a bigger space. Like it's incredible how hard it is to find space. So and then the affordability is bad enough, but it might take you a year or two just to even find a suitable space. And then you have to do your build out. And if it wasn't sort of previously a food manufacturing facility, you have to make sure all of your drainage and sanitation, all those pieces are in place for you to actually even be able to move in there and start your operations again. So it could be a 2 or 3 year process. So that really starts to affect capacity as well. So now BC companies in particular are having to try and increase capacity in a smaller footprint or in the same footprint. And meanwhile, if you need 20 people to run your production line, you always have 4 or 5 vacancies. It's really, really hard to scale up. So again, that's where automation, advanced manufacturing, there's something has to give, and I think there's some opportunities there for that. The regulatory environment is also always shifting. It's not easy to make food, and sometimes the people who make up the rules on what you're supposed to say on labels and things like that, it evolves very quickly. And it might seem like a good idea to make a very slight change to a nutritional panel on the packaging. The problem is, if you're a really small business, that could be your whole marketing budget for the year, to change your plate on a nutritional label, to change the font size. Like they've made so many different changes over the years. I think in between 2010 and 2020, there were 6 different changes to the nutritional labeling, and then they actually came out with a whole new nutritional system, and then they changed it again. So there's basically been, in the last 12 to 13 years, there's been about 6 or 7 changes. So yeah, small business, you have to spend $6,000 or $7,000 just to change it, and you're not changing any of the actual ingredients. It's just how it's laid out, it's how it's formatted, things like that. So just not a lot of consideration for that. But given how small the average business is in BC and across the country, it becomes really, really hard. Or say, for example, you've got 100,000 packs already printed, but it has to be gone in 3 months, and that's, you have to throw out $50,000 worth of packaging. Like those sorts of things, that's what happens just over a little change like that. So, and then of course, inflationary pressure. Did you guys know that there's inflation right now? I know, right? Yeah. So, yeah, we'll talk about that a bit later. It's been extra concentrated in BC. COVID's made it incredibly difficult. But then when we had the flood in November, how many people are here from BC? Or from BC? Oh, several of you. Okay, that's great. Yeah. So I mean, we saw a lot on the news about a lot of farms being underwater and everything. But when the highways were closed and everything, processors couldn't get food out, and we couldn't get ingredients in to make it. So you're either having companies that actually couldn't make product because they didn't have the ingredients, or they couldn't get it out. So and then there was other stuff where we had ingredients and equipment that were backed up in the port for weeks, where then they'd only have 10 days supply left and they're getting a call from the port saying that it's going to take 45 days to get those ingredients in. So we were sort of like a hotline where people were phoning us like, our powers are pretty extensive, but we can't remove backlogs in ports and things like that. And it was hard to hear though. We're getting emails and phone calls about every 15 or 20 minutes from somebody who's either going to run out of ingredients or have to throw away truckloads of product because they can't move it around. And it was certainly devastating for agriculture, but it was really hard for processing too. Sorry.
Like a lot of people lose product from like the expiring being stuck there?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you just couldn't get, like as an example, there's basically one major flour mill in BC that all the bakeries use, and that was in Chilliwack, and it got cut off from everybody. And when you're in the bakery industry, you can't just take, I used to buy flour from Bill and I'm going to buy it from Sally now. It doesn't work like that. Because every time you change the crop of flour, it affects everything. So it actually take weeks to reformulate your product using a new flour. So, so we went to government and say, can you help? And they said, well, we can get, flour up from Washington State. Well, that's great, but they won't actually have product for a month, even if they use that. So like those sorts of things. So, you try to make those Band-Aid solutions that don't actually help. So, but the really tough part, we actually did a survey with members, and since the flood crisis, ingredient costs are up 30%. And packaging costs is up about 15%. But the scary part was in the few weeks following the flood, freight rates went up, ranging from 250 to 400%. So we had a member, a friend of mine, runs a potato chip company here. Normally a truckload of potato chips coming from Vancouver to Toronto would be about $2,100 a load. And he was getting quotes for $11,000 for that same truck 3 weeks later. So the problem is when potato chips, you can only fit so many in a truck. So what they were dealing with was that increase in freight was more than the margin they were making on that shipment. But then so do we just decide not to ship for a month? Great, you're not going to ship to Loblaws for a month. What do you think the chances are that Loblaws is going to find somebody to replace you? If you saw in the news, they found a replacement for Frito-Lay, which is like dominates the potato chip category. What do you think they're going to do for like a small regional potato chip company, right? They'll find another solution like that. So now you're maybe short-term trying to save money, but long-term you're probably going to lose one of your biggest customers. So these are the sort of daily decisions a lot of these guys were having to deal with, right? It was a very, very stressful time for them. But you guys already know about inflation. So a lot of typically, in manufacturing, a lot of people want to acquire or develop their own facility. I mean, just with the cost and the availability. I mean, most people are just leasing, obviously. So it's really the only way. Nobody's going to have the cash outlay to be able to purchase their facilities. But we're starting to see a lot more about shared and commissary kitchen spaces being more prominent. I think there's a real opportunity for technology to make those more efficient for smaller businesses to grow. We're seeing a lot more money going into those shared use facilities. We're seeing a lot of investment capital going in there, and I think there's a huge opportunity for technology to help the efficiency of those. Does anybody know what a ghost kitchen is? Yeah, so during COVID, a lot of the restaurants were closing down. And then they were starting to open some of these ghost kitchens. So you'd actually have multiple restaurants making product in one central place and just shipping it directly when they were doing delivery. And actually, I had never heard about it before. And then we ordered dinner once from Cactus Club, and it came from an address in Cloverdale, which is actually where I live, and it was about 10 minutes from my house. And I thought, well, there's no Cactus Club there. Yeah, well, a lot of them were just closing their restaurants. It was way more efficient for them to use this shared space. But now that things have opened up again, they still have all the equipment and everything is there. So now we're starting to see processors starting to use these. So people are so desperate for space, they're even trying to use makeshifted food service and restaurant equipment and facilities to be able to make their products. So people are finding a way. As I mentioned, they're very resilient. But yeah, so some of these new things are coming up. But the other big thing we're seeing so many, and actually even some of the presenters at our conference yesterday, they don't even make their own product. They just have it co-packed. So they'll find a co-packer in Ontario or Halifax or in the US, and we're starting to see a lot more capital investment in co-packers as well. So there's a huge demand for capacity. You can build one with a lot of different types of technology in one facility, and you can just make product for other people. And so we're seeing more entrepreneurship. We're seeing that capital investment. And it's growing that way. Like we actually created that was the number one request that we get is trying to find a co-packer for somebody who, you know, doesn't have enough space to make a new, or they want to do a new product line and don't have space to bring in equipment. So, you know, it's a very entrepreneurial industry, so that's where people see that as an opportunity. But the number of co-packers is going up and the demand is also going up. So we actually created a matchmaking tool because there's a, you know, it's not just as easy as finding, well, I make granola and I want to find somebody to make it for me, because you have to understand, well, do they have the packaging capability? What are the order minimums? So there's a lot of different technical information that needs to be transferred. So we created this matchmaking tool, so you can basically go in and fill out all their information. Then if there's a match in the system, then, you know, you can do it. And it's led to a lot more business, which is great. But yeah, it's just, you know, if you can't find space to make your product, you have to find a way to grow somehow. So that's been becoming the more common way for businesses to try and scale up. So particularly in BC, but we're hearing so much more about this in the food industry is the focus on sustainability. I mean, some companies are making this, you know, a core part of their brand. Some startups are starting with, you know, that's their core, sort of their core focus is more about sustainability than anything else. You know, and we're hearing about it right throughout the supply chain, you know, right at the agricultural level, seafood, everyone's sort of trying to focus more on that. Sustainable practices, of course, food waste has become so prominent. I think most of us used to think about food waste just being at the consumer level. I know it drives me crazy every Friday when we have our organics pickup, when we go and take perfectly good food and take it out of the fridge and throw it away. That's a really small percentage of the total waste. There's waste happening at the agriculture level and at the processing level and at the retail level. And the problem is a lot of that time it's perfectly good product. But we don't have a very efficient mechanism for getting getting food that we can't sell to people that could really use it. So it's a very frustrating thing. I've been, you know, like I said, I've been in the industry for a long time. And I remember when I worked in the greenhouse industry at BC Hothouse, we had a grower bring 8 truckloads of peppers into our facility, but they didn't tell us, so we didn't even have a shift there. I don't know if you know how long, if you had an unrefrigerated truck with 28 pallets of peppers, how long they would last when it's 32 degrees outside. It'd basically be soup in a day. So we couldn't process it, so we couldn't sell it. And we spent half a day, I think about 20 of us, our staff spent about half a day phoning around trying to find people to take it. And we'd have food banks saying, well, we could probably take 1 case. Well, there's 128 cases on a pallet, and there's 28 pallets in a truckload, and we had 8 truckloads. So what do you think we did with all of that food? Landfill. Yeah, I attended a seminar, actually, and it was the VP of Sustainability for Walmart. They said that, yeah, well, this was 2 years ago. They said it was 10 times cheaper to throw unused food in the garbage than it is to try and repurpose it and find a new home for it. So we're starting to see a lot more focus on that, which is good. We're seeing retail focus on it. I think consumers are paying more attention to those sorts of things, businesses that are trying to find a way. So we're starting to find more technology, and we're seeing more, you know, apps and more of a concerted effort through the value chain to kind of fix that problem. Because it's really tough when you have people that don't have enough food to eat and we're throwing it in landfill. Like, it's not something that anybody feels particularly good about. So we need help. And so there've been so many different groups that have now popped up, which is great, but now understanding who does what and who doesn't do what and trying to connect them to each other, that's been the complex part. So we're spending quite a bit of time on that sort of thing because we really want to be part of solving that problem right through the value chain. How do we help the farmers do it? How do we help retailers do it? So it's, and even developing new channels to make it easier. Like, food banks are amazing, but they're not set up to, you know, take 8 pallets or of food on the fly. Like, they're just not designed that way. Yeah, obviously carbon footprint reduction. You know, we all pay a carbon tax here in BC. I think we're a bit ahead of the curve. I think we're paying more in carbon tax, and other provinces are starting to catch up. And then sustainable packaging. We're hearing more about biodegradable packaging. Right now it's tough though, because that costs quite a bit more. It's just not as commercial. So, you know, biodegradable packaging costs quite a bit more. So how do you increase your packaging cost by 20% when, well, yeah, I already mentioned some of those other cost increases. And then when we get to retail, the problem is retailers aren't letting processors pass those costs on. So all those ingredient costs, all that gets more expensive, retailer margins are going up because they're also increasing their prices for themselves. So they're not going to increase the prices twice. So if they, you know, if you're selling your granola bars for $3.29 retail and they take it up to $3.59, and then you come to them with a price increase, they're going to say, well, no, we already took a price increase on your product, so we have to wait a year. So now your costs have gone up 30% and you're stuck. You can't pass that on. So yeah, so all of a sudden that starts to curb things like, I want to get into sustainable packaging because, you know, that's gonna carry more costs. Well, if you can't carry the other costs you've already having to deal with, you're not going to be able to sort of innovate in new areas if it's gonna require added cost. And obviously, ethical ingredient sourcing is becoming much more topical. Consumers it's a lot of that's being driven by consumers. They're paying so much more attention to these things than they ever used to. So, you know, and I think brands, I always kind of think of a brand as it's sort of a promise to their customer. So if you're starting to be inconsistent with it, consumers are researching like they never have before. When I worked at Maple Leaf in their bakery division, we did a study on consumer behavior, and there was in an average Safeway, there was 139 different bread products, and the average consumer spent 30 seconds in the bakery section to make their decision. So how do you're just going to go in and grab what you think you want or whatever's on sale and throw it in your cart. Like there was not a lot of thought into it. But now that's starting to change a lot more. People are researching at home, they're looking online. So they're actually looking to see if you were doing what you say you're going to do. So it's good because it's actually starting to drive better behavior and driving better decision making about the types of ingredients people are using. Yeah, so we chatted about this a bit already. The flood crisis was unbelievable, and as you all probably know, costs go up a lot faster than they come down. So even now, I mean, we're now 7 months removed from when the flood happened, and costs are still elevated. Freight's still up about 30 or 40% from where it was before the flood, even though the roads have all opened up and everything else. So everyone's still dealing with that, and it's very, very disruptive. Our industry uses a lot of PPE. And it's funny, so I mentioned before we do a lot of advocacy work. I'd say probably the most important advocacy success that we've had in recent years is at the beginning of COVID, the food industry didn't even have an essential service designation. So then when we went to government to tell them that, they said, well, you know, it doesn't really make much difference. Well, every food company needs PPE. If you've ever been in a food plant, right, everyone's wearing masks and gloves. Like it's a very, very sanitary place. And all of a sudden, all the PPE distributors said, oh, sorry, we've been told we can only sell to essential services. So same thing I mentioned before with the flood thing. Our phones were ringing off the hook. It's like, I got 2 weeks supply of PPE, and the guy I've been buying from for 12 years is now saying he can't sell me masks or gloves or hand sanitizer or foot wash or anything. So everyone's like, what the hell are we supposed to do? So, and we very quickly got the essential service designation implemented, and then they were able to do that. But even something as simple as that, it's just like one little, okay, we declared a state of emergency and everything's going to healthcare. It's like, well, people still have to eat, right? So it was a very scary time, but you know, that was the sort of thing that it wasn't really in the news very often, but that's the type of thing that hits the industry. And then of course, workplace safety challenges with COVID. Of course, you heard about some of the poultry facilities that were, you know, had widespread infection and everything. Well, I don't know if you've been into some of these poultry plants. If you're squeamish, hopefully not, because it's, you know, they've all been designed like before World War II. And you think about some of these facilities, why were they designed that way? Well, they were designed because they're trying to maximize labor. They're trying to create as many jobs as possible, like, you know, post-war time and things like that. So they're shoulder to shoulder in there. But it was designed that way intentionally because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to employ as many people as possible. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, we have to be 6 feet apart now on the floor. Well, it's not designed that way. And you can't just sort of on the fly just sort of put conveyors in and things like that, because when your whole system is designed that way. And then the thing with the poultry industry is when you're processing chicken, like there's a very small window of age for chickens to be processed. So when there was that disruption early days of COVID, like if there was any sort of a delay in getting them from the farm to the processor, you can't process them. So they were actually having to cull chickens that got too old to be processed. So it's like hundreds of thousands of chickens being culled, which is a really nice word for killed, I guess, but it's what happens. So it's sort of an ecosystem, right? As soon as there's that one disruption, it has those sort of downstream reactions. So it was a very, very challenging time, especially in the early days. I already talked a bit about some of the disruptions on some of those sectors. They pretty much collapsed. Like we had one member who lost 90% of their business in about a week. So I mean, you just can't, when you're small and you don't have cash flow, you just can't rebuild it very quickly. Industry's found different ways though. I mean, how many of you order online now and maybe you didn't pre-COVID? Okay, yeah, so several of you. My wife loves Amazon and our dog hates the Amazon truck, but there's one, even if we don't order it, somebody else on our cul-de-sac ordered it and he comes through because we always know there's an Amazon truck because our dog goes nuts. But I mean, the food industry, a lot of small businesses, they just went direct to consumer. before, people were afraid of that because they said, well, I don't want to compete with my product on shelf. Well, if you're a small business and now the farmers markets are closed and you can't sell to retail and then your food service options are limited, how do you do it? Well, people were selling on Instagram. They set up Instagram accounts where you could click on the link, and they're trying to have that direct relationship with their consumers. Before, they'd usually rely on their, the people they were selling to do that. So, and a lot of people they're still doing that. Once you kind of build that relationship directly with the consumer and they can buy it directly from you, it's also, the margin's a lot better. If you're making the product and selling it at, say, at retail, they get half of that margin at least, or probably more, honestly. And then, so you're getting 60 or 70% margins as opposed to 20 or 30% margin. So e-commerce is going to continue to grow, and more people are buying. I think now people are conditioned. We very rarely bought online, but COVID kind of forced us to do it. Now that we're used to it, we're going to keep doing it. So, yeah, it's remarkable. Like Dea Foods, I'm not sure how many of you heard of Dea, but they were in the middle of building a 300,000 square foot facility here in Burnaby. And of course there was delays in getting the project built, but they had a record year, and they just pushed through, and people needed food. I think that's probably the one constant with the food industry, right? People need to eat. So it sort of felt like there was this like moral responsibility from a lot of companies in the food industry to sort of make sure that they were kind of keeping the chains moving, keeping product flowing, and going out there. And a lot of them ended up having success because they were just able to overcome some of those different hoops and obstacles to make it happen. So we just did a supply chain study. I'll go through it quickly. I'll just do a quick time check. So we just completed a supply chain study because there was so much that we felt people didn't understand about what was happening, and then what those solutions were. So it took us a year. We actually worked with Jerry, the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation. They funded this study. We partnered with MNP. So what we really wanted to do was not just we wanted to look at what some of those key things were, but then we actually did a lot of focus groups and worked with industry to kind of discover what those best practices were and what were some of the tools and measures that people put into place to mitigate some of those things and how to build in better resilience through the supply chain. So we spent a lot of time investing on that, and we just finished the draft actually that we're pretty excited about, and we actually have a best practices guide just to really help businesses. So I think everyone was so open and transparent about the different things that they did. Sometimes it can be such a protective industry, right? Looking at your small business, you think that you have to protect everything and be very secretive, but everyone was really open and transparent. We actually sort of discovered a lot of different nuggets about how we could build in better resiliency and teach and provide better tools and information to our members to arm themselves a bit better. So the scope was really just sort of assessing the impact of COVID, and then just making best practices, and then also just identifying additional items. Like we couldn't do everything. We didn't want to try and boil the ocean, or it would have been this useless document that just cost a bunch of money. I think there's too many expensive binders probably in government shelves here and there. So we wanted to make sure that it was something meaningful and beneficial. So we identified several things that were out of scope of the project, but then required further study. And so just when we were kind of looking at the disruption, I mentioned before, especially with the flood, but even during COVID, procurement and sourcing, just, if you're getting ingredients from China or from other countries internationally, all of a sudden with freight, everything stopped, and all the PPE was starting to come over in containers and everything. Everything, like a lot of it was food and ingredients, and we realized how vulnerable the food economy is. And a lot of processors use 15 or 20 ingredients in their final product, and they might be getting that from 3 or 4 countries. So imagine like once COVID hit, that disruption, and a lot of them didn't have a plan B. But those smaller businesses, the first thing that happened, the really big companies were really trying to lock in and forward buy to get their volume commitment, so that at least they had that consistent supply. And it was the small ones that got hurt. So the bigger guys were able to do that because they had the buying power and the cash flow to kind of secure that. But if you're small, it was hard, and that all of a sudden the price of the amount available for smaller businesses shrunk like that. And of course, that's why the price went up as much as it did. Sales and forecasting just got disrupted because all of their access to customers was impacted. Transportation, which we talked about already. Labor and human resources, just understanding, what are the different protocols. I mean, the protocols around labor changed daily, right? It was a constant change about what the different systems were and how people were supposed to be testing their employees and how employers were supposed to be reporting feeling symptoms and all that sort of thing. So staying on top of that was very disruptive. Importing anything became very difficult, just maintaining consistency on manufacturing, and then warehousing. Because people were, all of a sudden inventory started to build up of different things, and it disrupted the whole supply chain. So even finding places for extra materials or trying to forward buy to kind of build up inventory, it was hard to do. Yeah, so I'll touch on this really quickly, but yeah, basically cost of inputs, lack of labor, just reliability on global supplies. It just, the whole ecosystem got disrupted, and it just created this chain reaction throughout the supply chain. There's a number of other ones, but they're not quite as important. So a lot of people, they had to shift and find secured, they had to have a backup plan on everything, and that's something that they hadn't had before. And what we're hearing from people is that's one of the most common things that they've done. They're sort of having an option A and B, which is unique for BC, because there's been a lot of frustration from the ag sector. If you have a company that say uses broccoli as an ingredient, and they're buying broccoli from China because it's 15 cents a kilogram cheaper than the farm 20 minutes away. Sometimes those are just the realities of it. I think this is I think it's actually going to drive more desire to use more local ingredients and create a stronger regional food economy. So that's, those are some of the offshoots that we're going to, that we're seeing that could actually long-term help. And just building up of inventory, secured distribution options. So you're just really coming up with plan Bs from top to bottom. So 25% have said that they've fully recovered, but almost 60% said that they're not all the way back, and then 17%. Those are the hard ones to see, because we saw a lot of members, they just canceled their membership because they couldn't even afford a $200 membership to the association, because you had to choose between that and paying your staff or keeping the lights on. Of course, it's a silly choice. Yeah, so we're doing a deeper dive into sort of these three key areas: warehousing, labor, and transportation. Those were sort of the three that came up as being the most disruptive and where people were the most vulnerable. So we've identified a couple of different sort of more around shared, because everyone is having to absorb these costs on their own as small businesses, which wasn't sustainable. So we're looking at some sort of shared options on these different things to help mitigate risk. Yeah, and we identified a number of different things, but we want to look at shared warehousing opportunities. Yeah, we also, same thing, having that best practices guide for industries to help each businesses build a bit more resiliency into their business models was a really important one. Yeah, and we also want to look at the labor needs, because again, we keep talking about foreign workers. That seems to be the government's reaction to everything, and it's just not enough. Yeah, and then we've made a number of recommendations to government, but we want to look at sort of logistics and financing options and potential participation of a shared distribution. We think that there's some key areas where there's a lot of potential for that could reduce costs and mitigate risk. But I think the mitigating a risk I think most people are always focused on maximizing margin, but mitigating risk is just becoming such a bigger part of everybody's business model now. Yeah, and just looking at capacity improvements across the transportation network. We've got to do something. We can't just stop life for 2 months when we have a flood. And then obviously the immigration program is just not working. We're going to skip past this part. I was just going to mention this part I highlighted because it's really key. We've been really advocating for the government. The government really needs to change the lens on how they view innovation, because most processors don't need new-to-the-world technology. There's a huge need, we already talked about, there's a huge need for investment in advanced manufacturing and automation. And there's cost disadvantages, but a lot of the innovation funding that's available that would really help small businesses do that, it has to be sort of new-to-the-world technology. And I've been in this industry a long time, and I could count on my hand the number of people that really need new-to-the-world technology in the food industry. They need to take something existing and adapt it, right? One of the speakers yesterday talked about MacGyvering a machine to be able to, they created a new product and nothing existed, but they didn't want to create something new because it probably would have taken years. So they found something new and they rigged it in a certain way so they could actually make the product the way they wanted to make it. But there was no funding available for that. The only way they could get funding is for them to go and create something brand new and probably spend $1 million on this new piece of equipment. But they just needed to change a few things to get it to work. That never meets the criteria for funding around innovation. So we've talked to the Federal Minister Bebeau and Regional Minister Popham about the need to sort of redefine that lens and making it easier for companies to invest. And I think that's going to create huge opportunities, because that point is really starting to resonate with government. I think the idea of automation was always about eliminating jobs, and of course, job creation is sort of one of the mantras for everybody trying to get elected, right? You want to create jobs. But now it's not about eliminating jobs anymore. It's about mitigating risk. Like if you're an employer that hires 50 people and you lose 50 people all in the same year, like you're not going anywhere. You need to be able to find those jobs, and it's a very specialized industry. You can't automate everything in the food industry, but to the extent that you can, like those sort of some of those menial, less monotonous, repetitive jobs. The more you can automate in those areas, even at a basic level, even small businesses can mitigate risk. So we're starting to get some progress there, which I think is going to create a lot of longer-term opportunities around technology in the food industry. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, our population is shrinking, and fewer people are not wanting these jobs anymore. So that's really the only real solution that over the long term, because people are never going to be the solution in this country, not for a very, very long time, unless there's some very major demographic shifts, and then we're probably talking generations before this problem is fixed, and I don't think we have the luxury of that kind of time. So that's kind of what we've really been focusing on. I think we can see more grant programs and investment to foster investment in technology. I think that's going to be beneficial, and it's taken years, but we're finally starting to see some traction. I think just maybe that's a positive outcome of COVID. There aren't very many, but that could be one where I think they're just sort of realizing how vulnerable the food supply is, and they're starting to realize the food supply is an essential service. It's pretty remarkable that we didn't always think about it. I think it's just because you take the food industry for granted, right? You go to the store, it's full of shelves. The shelves are full of a million different products. You never have to think about it. I mean, does everybody remember the empty shelves in the grocery stores? I know toilet paper was in the news, which was super weird, but there was a lot of empty shelves in the meat section and everywhere else, and I think we'd have to go back to probably the Great Depression the last time we saw empty shelves, and we really don't want to see that ever again. So I put this. I just had a little industry trends piece, but I know I'm out of time, so I think we need to shift to the Q&A. So I just kind of built a couple of extra slides in there just in case we had time, but. We certainly have some time for questions, and if there aren't any, then I can do this as well. So, any questions? Yeah.
You see on the news that there's an inevitable food shortage. That you have indications of that coming?
I think food shortages are not going to be like widespread. I think there's going to be certain areas that are going to be more vulnerable. So, I think. Do you mean sort of in a national context or? Yeah.
Like people saying, in the next couple of years, there's going to be a food shortage. I don't know. Maybe I'm watching the wrong news.
Yeah. No. I mean, no. It's. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to that. I mean, if we don't make some changes and we don't build that more resiliency, which is what we were trying to kind of do through our supply chain model, then there certainly is risk of that. Like nobody wants to be, culling 300,000 chickens in a span of 2 weeks and things like that. So those create short-term disruptions for sure. I think just everyone's recognizing that each region needs to be a bit more self-sustaining. It's kind of funny because the food industry is very regionalized already. Like it's like in BC and everything. Like a lot of those companies, they're really focused on those areas. But at the same time, I mean, everyone's trying to scale and grow and bring in products like ingredients wherever they can. So it's just we're seeing such a shift towards trying to find, that second and third option. But, the other issue we're dealing with is with climate change because, the drought, for example, we've got some members that make gluten-free snack products. And I guess the gluten-free oats, because of the drought last year, the supply was reduced by 50%. And actually in the US, it was worse than that. And the quality was so poor, they actually have to use 30% more raw materials just to get the finished product they need. So essentially, if you like gluten-free snacks and you need gluten-free oats, there's like 80% less supply. So there are those risks, but it's kind of funny. Like maybe I'm a corny optimist, but it just seems like people do find a way to kind of shift and do that. But sometimes it's tough though. Like how do you replace 80% supply? Like you just can't. So certainly short-term disruptions. I'm hoping that I think we've learned a lot from COVID about how to build in that resiliency. So hopefully that will mitigate it. I think the really important part will be agriculture and making sure that we're continuing to invest in agriculture and ag tech. We can't just keep building parking lots and condos on farmland. And BC's cracked down on that quite a bit. So I mean that they're fairly militant about kind of maintaining what we have. I think that's really key. But farmers also have to be able to make a living. Like if there's easier ways to make a living, then and if you look at the average age of the farmer, I just talked about processing. I think that's where I see a longer term risk. Like the average age of the farmer in Canada is something like 62. And a lot of their kids don't want to take over the farm. Like, who's going to do it? Like I think those are kind of some of the bigger risks, and I certainly don't have any solutions for it. So I think there's one over here first.
I've got a question.
Sorry.
Industries and automations, and so
Yeah.
I'm interested in, when you, as an analogy, if you look at BC Hydro putting rebates, and you have a heat or plumbing company advertising, buy my air conditioner and you get rebates. So
Yeah.
what I'm kind of proposing is if we are to work together, or even if we join the BCFD, where we can be advised on what those grants that are going to be coming. And when we're out trying to automate a facility, we can say, well, here, you can get $4,000 and I'll help you maybe fill the paperwork out. Is that how we might be able to work?
Yeah, I think the solution around technology is sort of going to be multi-layered. I mean, where we've started is even with government about just changing that definition of innovation so that people can get grants. Like if you can get $50,000 in grants that you couldn't get before, there's a huge incentive, especially if they're having to bring in equipment from offshore or other countries and stuff. It's not that even the exchange rate can be problematic, but it's more than that, right? It's got to be more than that. I think working with the Fortis BCs and the BC Hydros to kind of build in those credits. It's got to start with government though, and then once there's that recognition of the need, like there's a strategic need to invest in technology. So I mean, I think there'll be a number of potential solutions for that. I actually think that's a great suggestion, right? I mean, that's why we bought a heat pump, because we got $1,500 in credits for putting in a heat pump. It's the same thing.
So the joint organization's $200 for covering?
Well, it depends. There's a whole range, and I'm happy to send you a link on it. So
My point is that we would get that communication and these grants, and so we can be, kept abreast of how you're percent.
yeah, of course, yeah, and we sort of want to communicate that to all of our members as well too. So whenever there's opportunities like that, we want to make sure that's probably one of the biggest things that we do. It's our outreach capability, because our membership, like our outreach goes far beyond our membership as well. So it's but those credits, those sorts of things are important, because there's so many different layers of cost involved in investing in those things. So those more solutions, it just makes it easier. As soon as you start to like lower that bar and make it easier for people to invest, and people are just doing it now because they're so sick of just trying to hire people, and when they can't do it, posting applications and getting 0 applicants, or having 3 applicants and have none of them show up for interviews. Like something's got to give, but because that's this reality, and that's just not the food industry. That's everywhere, right? It's amazing, and even manager level jobs. I talked to a member, they had a finance manager apply, and somebody with like 10 years experience, and they didn't even show up for the interview. And then they phoned them and were like, oh yeah, I got a job somewhere else. I mean, I think about me, I would like hyperventilate if I was 5 minutes late for a job interview. These people aren't even showing up. Like, it's showing how much there's sort of an attitude shift as well, right? So I think, yeah, you had the question, and I'll come back to you. Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. They just I mentioned, so there's a group called the Agricultural Land Reserve, the ALR, and they regulate sort of agricultural space. Just a few months ago in BC, they redefined to allow vertical farming on agricultural land, because before they couldn't. So now, and there's actually there's a few businesses in BC. There's actually one called Cubic Farms, which is quite interesting. They basically just trailers, and they have vertical farms where everything grows, and there's a limitation on what you can grow in them. There's like microgreens and items like that, but it's pretty remarkable when you stand there, and they've got all them on conveyors that go up and down, and you can literally open the door of the truck, and everything just comes to you. So from a labor perspective, they just have to stand there and pick it as it kind of comes through. So I mean, I think it's got a lot of potential for Canada, but I think about Saudi Arabia and places like that where they can't grow, and you can build those things. They're completely contained, so you could put those as long as you have a power source, you could do them in the desert or anywhere. So I think over the long term, like that intensive agriculture is I think it's going to be really important. I think it has a ways to go in development, just because, like I said, microgreens is a great start in some of those types of things, but if you can't grow tomatoes and carrots and things like that in that sort of an environment. So I think but it's pretty early days though, but yeah, it's cool. So there's a lot of interesting things. There's a real focus on ag tech, and that falls into that as well, sort of like how you improve yields and how do you do more vertical farming and more indoor farming and all those sorts of things. So it's a fascinating space for sure. Yes?
It seems like sustainable packaging is something that everybody wants, but nobody else can pay for.
Yes?
Is it kind of stalled at that point, or is there any way to get that roadblock lifted?
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, like organics was kind of a fringe category 25 years ago, and it kind of started off, and you know, you used to have to pay double for organics, and now I don't know, it's maybe 10 or 15%, and it just takes time, you know, just sort of, it's just I think this last couple of years has just been such a disruption because there's been such a upheaval in cost across the board, kind of that moving into that space where you've got that price premium, sort of like if you can't pass your regular costs on, it's pretty hard to pass on those costs. I think long term, absolutely. I think I think it has to go that way, you know, because we talked about food waste and everything, but even just landfill and those sorts of things, like those are going to be, you know, sooner or later you could even see the government starting to kind of sort of mandate some of those things as well. So, and sometimes those end up becoming the triggers where you're saying, well, by a certain date, people need to be not using certain types of packaging. I mean, it's certainly happened before. So, I mean, it could be something like that, but you know, those companies that really want to be focused on sustainability, they want to be credible to their brand, they're going to have to start to move that way anyway. So I think it's just going to take time, and then the cost will kind of start to come down, and people will want it more. I think it's the more consumers demand it. I think the most power lies with the consumer, and if they start preferring brands that are actually going to be using that, then they don't mind paying a bit more. So, yeah.
And this is a personal one. So
Sure.
you always see on a package, processed in Chile.
Mhm.
You don't know what country it's coming from. And we're getting more and more concerned about certain countries.
Yeah.
So if you are really interested in finding out where that stuff's coming from, is there any way you can find that or not?
It's
a hidden thing.
Yeah, well, there's different rules around, you know, like percentages and stuff. Like most of the time they've tried to change the rule. They made a number of changes to the labeling requirements now about that kind of limit some of that. We used to say, you know, product of Canada or made in Canada, that sort of thing. So now if there's a certain amount of foreign content, you're not allowed to do that anymore. So it's cleaned up a little bit. It's pretty hard. I know a few years ago there was a lot of talk about traceability and using like blockchain and things like that. And there's some companies that are doing that, but blockchain's pretty tricky in the food industry if you have 20 different ingredients. You know, I know it's been quite, you know, trendy in like the gold industry and the diamond industry where you've got like one ingredient that goes into it. So I think we're a ways away from that, but it's, yeah, I think most companies are pretty reputable, and I think especially in Canada, like they've definitely got a lot of rules and regulations about that. Certainly maybe food coming in from other countries that might be less so. It's kind of weird sometimes the Canadian government is actually stricter on, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but they're a lot stricter about products manufacturing in Canada than their enforcement of imported products. So it's good because it means Canada has a really good reputation, but on the other hand, it sometimes creates an unlevel playing field where you've got, you know, you could walk through a grocery store and probably find 50 things that aren't compliant, but they're imported, and they're like, well, we don't have capacity to deal with that. But if you're a Canadian manufacturer and you tried to do that, they would shut you down. You know, so like I said, it's good globally and over the long term. I mean, it helps Canada's reputation, but yeah, it can be really frustrating though if you've got people that you know are cheating and people are buying their product, you know, that's $1 cheaper than yours. So, but you know, I think overall, like the product that's made here is the rules are definitely set to lock that in. So, any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks for letting me spend some of the morning with you.
Thank you. Really appreciate your insights.